In this episode of PowerTech 10, I'm going to be introducing Eric Weingartner of Weingartner Racing's cam test. This time it's on a small block Chevy. Details are a little bit different to what you might normally expect for a cam test, so watch along and see where we're going with this. Hi, David Vizard here. You guys are watching PowerTech 10. This is something of a monumental edition here. This is episode 200. Can't believe I've done that many episodes so far. Anyway, on with the show. Basically, the video content here is about Eric Weingartner's cam shootout on a small block Chevy. Now it is something a little different to normal in terms of the shootout, and I'm going to show you something that if you're so equipped you can do a cam spec that is going to be right on for one aspect of this. What do I mean by that? Well, this cam shootout is something a little different. It's going to be one single cam for each competitor is going to be tested in a normally aspirated engine. Then that same engine is going to have a blower mounted on it, 5 pounds, and a nominal 5 pounds of boost put into it. I say nominal because the pulley will be sized on the stock motor at 5 psi. But the pulleys won't be changed to make it 5 psi on every engine. The drive is not a question of boost. It's a question of how much air the cam will allow the supercharger to move into the engine. In other words, it is the ease with which air will pass into the engine and the efficiency with which it traps it. So, going to be one normally aspirated, one at 5 pounds boost nominal, and one at 10 pounds boost nominal. Now, there's going to be some problems with that, but I'm going to deal with that. If you watched Eric's original and subsequent dyno shootouts, that's first one with the LS engine, second one with the Ford, you will note, or you should have got the idea, that these dyno tests cost money. The LS one made some money, both for the competitors who did well in it, and it covered Eric's costs, so that was good. The Ford one, not so good. Eric broke even on it just about, but it was a lot of work, and we learned one thing here. The way things are going with the Chevrolet one on entries at the moment, well, not so much entries but donations, is the LS1 engine is a far more popular engine than the small block Chevy. I must make note of that. Well, come to think of it, I have. I finished my LS cam prediction program, which we'll go into shortly. Not in this video, but shortly. Anyway, here's my point. Eric is donating a lot of his time to this. You guys are going to benefit more than he does, because you will get the facts of the matter as it stands in the way that it's tested. Now, some of you may not agree with the test procedures here, but it's the same for everything. I entered the LS1 knowing that whether I didn't agree with some of the testing or not, it was the same for everyone. So there's an element here of sportsmanship involved. So if you can't deal with it as it is, then don't complain. Don't want to hear it. Nor does Eric. Right? If you don't like the way the rules are set, don't enter. However, if you take a look at the rules, you'll see there's a lot of things to be learned, especially the fact that I don't know if anybody's done a cam test of one cam with basically what are 3 different engines in terms of their manifold pressures. Now, I'm not entering this time as such, but I am going to put in a suggestion of what I would use for the cam for a normally aspirated engine here. I might deal with the others down the road. So here's what I want you to do. Just send Eric a $20 check and have it over with. I made a point of this in my last video. Don't be that guy that tries to avoid paying, right? Be the guy that says, okay, I've got this, when you're next in the bar. I said there, see if you can man up to this. Just do Eric a favor, and you'll be doing me a favor as well, because that means I'll have the grade of readership that I thought I had. Anyway, on with the point here. Let's now look at the spec of the engine. The cylinder heads were pretty special. They were Brodex Dragon Slayers, ported by Eric, and they flowed really good, as you'll see in the flow figures. But the basic configuration here was, and I'm looking at the screen here so I can remember all this: intake valve 2 1/8 diameter, exhaust valve 1.6. Nothing really special sounding in the way of a spec there, but decent. But it's always the flow that matters. So let's have a look and see what the next thing on the list is. It is the intake port was 255 cc's. Exhaust port does not have that here, so we'll just have to assume that it's fairly normal volume. Chamber volume was 63 cc's, and with our spec of bore, stroke and clearances, etc., that gives an 11.44 compression ratio. Now let's look at the flow figures. I cut these off at 800 lift, although Eric flowed them up to 1,000 or 1 inch. And let me give you the best flow figures first. 346 CFM at 1 inch. And for the exhaust, that 1 inch figure was 250, all but 1/10 of a CFM. Now, for the real numbers, we're not going to be using anything more than about 800 lift with this setup, so let's take a look at what the flow bench delivered there. And for the exhaust, that 1 inch figure was 250, all but 1/10 of a CFM. Now, for the real numbers, we're not going to be using anything more than about 800 lift with this setup, so Let's take a look at what the flow bench delivered there. You don't have to be in possession of a great deal of porting skills, knowledge, know-how, etc. to see that these are some pretty impressive flow figures. Low down, good for a 2 1/8 inch valve. Up the top, really good. First point to note here is that if you are putting boost into an engine, then really it's not a question of how much boost the engine makes, but how easy it can get it from the supercharger into the cylinder. Right? The more efficient the blower is at doing this, the more power the engine will make per pound of boost that it's fed. Now, it's often thought that the more boost you have, the more power you must make. Not quite true. There's a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. The charge gets too hot, it detonates too easy, so you don't get as much ability to use the compression that might be in the engine to make power, or the boost. A good friend of mine, and that would be Jerry Magnuson, the late Jerry Magnuson, who is probably one of the great supercharger minds of the 20th century, once said to me, and I thought this is a great way to put it, was that if you wanted to show the most boost with a supercharger, all you have to do is weld the intake valve closed. Not going to make any power there, but if the supercharger is still able to be turned by something, the boost will be the highest. Why? Because it just goes on stacking it in until leakage defeats the whole scheme in terms of getting power. So what we're looking for here is not quite as distinct as it may at first seem. It's not get boost, whoa, there we go. No, it is get density of air, where you're trying to get the most weight of air into that cylinder per intake stroke. Now, if you can increase the air pressure without using any horsepower to do it, i.e. drive to the bottom of a 2-mile deep mine, there will be no pumping loss from the supercharger, because you'll probably have something like about 4 pounds of boost. About. I could calculate it, but it's neither here nor there. It'll prove my point. Now, what we need then is a cylinder head that flows a lot of air in from the boost we're giving it, and a lot of exhaust out. Remember, when you supercharge an engine, you really should change the intake to exhaust ratio on flow. Why? Because if you put 5 pounds of boost into the engine, and let's say it's an efficient engine, the intake valve is going to look like it's a third bigger than it really is. So straight away, we need to be looking at even with 5 pounds of boost, we should be looking at an intake valve and an exhaust valve of about the same size each. Now, you can see that the flow of each valve is now going to become more important. We can't stifle the engine because we can't get the exhaust out, and we must be able to let that supercharged pressure in. So that's the first thing. So whereas our cylinder head is more than just fine for a normally aspirated engine, it isn't exactly right for a supercharged engine. 10 pounds is even more not right. Now, within the framework of Eric's rules, the only way we can compensate for the head not being right is by juggling around with the cam events, with the valve events. What are we going to need to make the best of our cylinder head with a change in the cam. Firstly, if we're aiming for the same kind of spread in the power band, we can juggle a little bit with the valve events. First off, because the intake valve looks bigger, it looks like the overlap area is bigger. Now this won't apply to a turbo engine, but with a positive displacement or mechanically driven supercharger with no excess back pressure due to a turbocharger, then we're looking at a different kettle of fish. But we're not. We've got a positive displacement here. That roots blower is going to deliver boost everywhere in the RPM range with a deduction only due to leakage. Now that can be quite substantial at low RPM. Also, because of the amount of time it has, some boost can go out the exhaust. So you can always expect less boost at low RPM. To compensate for that, you can open the valve, intake valve, later. So, if we say we had a cam on 108 lobe center line angle for the non-turbo, the non-supercharged engine, we may have to step it up to 110, maybe 111. Those are numbers I'm guessing at the moment from experience. That would be good. Now, also, because we are making the intake valve look bigger whilst holding the exhaust the same, we probably can pull the timing, the cam timing back some. That's the usual trend. So we're looking at an intake which has the intake center line retarded, and we're looking at a cam which has the lobe center line angle widened. We also need to make sure that we've moved those events the right way. Now, exhaust, that can probably stay in the same position, more or less, right? Because we haven't done anything to the exhaust side like we would with a turbo, which put up a lot of flow resistance. So what we have then, intake opens later. Exhaust stays about the same position. About. That's either for the 5 or 10 pound boost. Now of course the 10 pound boost will need to exaggerate those requirements. So that's where we're at there. So we do need a substantially different cam. Another thing we have to take care of here is the fuel being used. In this instance, it's E85, and I can see why Eric's gone this route, because the range which we need to cover in terms of being detonation free over the various induction pressures needs to be high. 11.5, we're getting on that way, with 10 pounds of boost is approaching a respectable and safe limit. So, how does that affect things? Well, it's quite simple. The exhaust, the volume of exhaust created by an alcohol fuel is bigger than it is with a gasoline type fuel. So, just from that, the exhaust valve needs to be bigger yet again. Now, the problem is we can't go on altering cylinder heads from our general purpose, normally aspirated head, ad lib. No, there's a limit other than making a custom cylinder head, right? That would be the way to go. But the cylinder heads are already dictated here. So that's it. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how the program that Stan Weiss and I have done, our TorqueMaster CAM program, works. And you will see that it calculates pretty much everything you need to know about the engine. Now, we've done this for the camshafts for small block Chevy, whatever cubic inches it is, plus big block Chevy, again, just a cam only. LS engine, just a cam only. And Ford engine, just a cam only. And you'll see what I mean when I say just a cam only. What this does is the three of the last ones I've just said, they will calculate what you need for a camshaft. Stop. The Chevy one calculates what you need to optimize your entire engine. Eventually it'll even get down to telling you what spark plugs to use. So the Chevrolet one that I'm going to show you now is a deal which covers the entire build except gaskets and washers. You know, so here we go. Let me show you what that does. So here is our title page, in the most leery shades of purple you can imagine. You may not like it, but you probably won't forget it. From here, our first move is to hit the Enter button. Here we are at the second page. In this page, we enter the engine type that we're dealing with. For us, that's the small block Chevy. After we've done that, we hit the Enter, which brings us to the page that defines what type of cam we want, i.e. solid, hydraulic, flat or roller. Tap it. So we make that decision here and then go to Enter once more. So let's start going through all the things you need to enter about your engine for these cam computations to start taking place. I haven't entered the right numbers, but here we go. First, bore, stroke, rod length, intake valve size, exhaust valve size, compression ratio, your intended peak power RPM, and intended rocker ratios, and whether you want a single phase or a dual phase cam. Next, we move over the page and we have the induction length we've got from the plenum to the valve, and the reflective wave function that we need, and that's usually 4. To crunch the data we've so far put in, we move across the page and click on this button here, which brings us to this page here. Now let's zoom in on the first column there so that I can explain the value of these outputs. First one's cubic inches, which is nothing special, but it's nice to know what it is precisely within the half a cubic inch. Now the next one, I want you to note this, any box that's got a little red rectangle by the side of it produces data or an explanation of what you need to know from this. For instance, we've got on there peak horsepower piston speed, and it says 4,350. Now if you go down to the bottom of the page, and we can't get the whole width of the page in, you will see 3 lines of explanations about what your peak piston speed should not exceed for any given type of crank you've got. If you've got a cast one, it'll be a lower RPM than if you've got a super billet high grade steel one. So that's useful so that you'll know you'll be working within the confines of the capability of the parts. Note, no other cam program will produce these figures, so you don't actually know for sure what your peak RPM can be. Now let's move across the page here. We come to the first item that is a huge debate amongst cam specialists and users alike. Most of them are out of date. This is the low centerline angle of the cam, which many believe is an output, not an input. Here it is definitely an output, but not of any other aspect other than dyno tested figures and a mathematical formula made up to calculate that low centerline angle. A good point here is to go and see episode 85, which actually demonstrates the method that was used to be able to calculate that lobe centerline angle. It was very extensive. Going down the list, we have the intake duration, degrees, at 6 thousandths, and the exhaust duration, degrees, 6 thousandths. Following down the column, we come to the overlap at 6 thousandths tappet lift. Nothing special there, that's an easy computation, but it's followed by what the advance should be. Now here we have something of special interest, because in about 90% of the cases, the advance that the cam company gives you to put into the cam is wrong. Now, this is not to say that this one is exactly right. It's just a whole bunch more accurate. The amount of advance depends on the flow figures as the valve comes off the seat and on the intake, and as it closes on the exhaust. And small changes in this can make a difference on that number. Now, this number assumes a typical discharge coefficient in the first part of the valve lift. If you've got a super efficient valve, the advance will be less. If it's not that efficient, the advance will be more. However, this is the figure to install it by if you don't know. Going down the list, we have the intake centerline. That will be full lift at, in this case, 104. Next is the recommended minimum intake lift and the recommended minimum exhaust valve lift. Now we come to a nice one here, the vacuum at idle. Many people want a cam that gives them sufficient idle vacuum to do certain things like power brakes or idle nicely or whatever. This computation here turns out to be within about 1 inch of mercury, and of course it does depend on your work on the engine, on how well it seals up. That vacuum idle is pretty precise if everything seals up to a normally good value. Now, there's no other cam program that will tell you what that is, so there you go. And it also tells you down in the bottom, as we just saw, how to alter that number so that it falls in line with what you want. And here's what we find across the page. Top line, dynamic compression ratio. Now this gives you a guide as to how much compression there will be with the cam of the duration and intake closing point that you have compared with a static compression. So this has come out at 8.4. If we're running ethanol as we are here, we want that number to be about 8.5. Can be a bit higher, but then you need to be wary about temperatures and things like that. If we're running high octane pump gas like 93, then that number wants to be about 8 to 8.2. If we're running race gas, regular ordinary type race gas, 105 octane or so, 9 to 1. If we're running super high octane fuel like 113 or 115 octane stuff, I think it goes that high, then we want that to be well over 9, something like 10 to 1. Now, you'll notice I've arrowed a little red rectangle by the side of the dynamic compression. That rectangle appears in all the squares going down, and when you focus on what it says at the bottom of the page, it will explain all the things you need to take care of. How to get that 8.4 compression ratio right by the duration of the cam, and you can check to see if it's right by the estimated torque potential and horsepower potential. If you're looking for a good street motor, you want to maximize the torque. Leave the horsepower till second place. If you are doing a race motor, or where the top end is the most important, then get the maximum combined estimated torque and horsepower. Going on down the page, we have the minimum required CFM port flow for the head that we're doing. 352 it says here. The one we've got is 355, that's close enough. Going down to the intake port CCs, we've got 255 on the Weingartner head, and we're reading 246. This disparity between the two will actually favor the torque if we build it with this spec, but it's still a good figure. It's close enough to approach the horsepower we're looking at here, and we shouldn't worry too much about being 9 cc's off. Now, induction length. The combined length of the intake port to the manifold face plus the manifold face to the plenum comes out at an average of 12.18. There we start to see a slight problem. If we use the fourth wave, which is probably the best, that setup will tune at 6,076 RPM for the peak horsepower, and for the peak torque RPM 4,739. So we do have an intake length that is a little longer than we might want, but that'll favor the torque some, so we will trade off some horsepower and probably get a little more torque, all things being equal. Now, one thing here I want to say, that the power potential is pretty accurate. It is scaled for 300 RPM per second acceleration rate on a superflow dyno. Now, I know Eric uses a different one to that for high speed, but I'm sure if he does a check at 300 RPM and then one at high speed, the figures will be within about 15 horsepower. But we'll see. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of data there. So now let's go and see what we can get from it. At this point, we scoot across the page to the Update Excel button and click on that, which brings us to an Excel spreadsheet which has, now wait for this, over 2,000 cam combinations on it. Now these are all comp cams profiles. That's more than they've got in their catalogs. How do they know that some of the profiles that they've abandoned in their catalogs aren't functional in some combination now? They don't. This brings any of those to light. So instead of having just the ones in their catalog, you have got over 2,000 combinations from which you can choose that will get your cam 99% right first time. No guessing, no going on, well, this worked in so-and-so's engine, so I guess it'll work it. That's just guesswork. In this day and age, do we want to rely on guesswork or the power of a modern computer and AI? Going down the page and expanding it, we come to this. This is about a fifth of the number of cam profiles that comp cams can put together to grind the computed version of what your engine needs. Now, let's go on from here. On the far left of that yellow band, we have the cam part number. Now this is the last thing that we're going to know, because we have got to define what we want to get that part number. Next across the page is the suffix for cams intended for 1987 to 1989 OE hydraulic rollers. You just add that as a suffix onto the cam part number, so your cam is cut on the right blank. Next across the page is whether or not you want a street strip cam. You had that option in the previous page to say whether you wanted street strip or race. Going across one more line, we get single pattern or dual pattern. Going further across the page, we come to the lobe centerline angle. Now, just a reminder here, don't forget what we're looking at here in that list of cams below that yellow strip is 385 cams. And remember I said we'll select one that works for you in about 90 seconds. Well, bear with me, I'll show you how that's done. Here we are, one more step across the page, but before we go any further, you'll notice there's some red numbers at the top of these columns here. Every time you see one of those red numbers, what it is a reminder of what you actually want from that column. In other words, these numbers come from what you've computed. But anyway, on with the show. Next column across from the lobe center line is the overlap at 6 thousandths. Going further is the intake duration at 6 thousandths. Then the intake duration at 50 and the intake duration at 200. And moving on to the next set of columns, we have the intake intensity, the lobe area. That's a very useful figure to have because you may have cams with identical 6 thousandths and 50 thousandths timing and near identical lifts that differ quite substantially in area. How will you know the difference? This is the only way you'll know, by the lobe area. Right, so that's another factor there. You can't get out of a catalogue or from any tech desk guy what the lobe area is of the cam. Next, the aggression index. Now that's something that only this program has. You know why? Because it's something Stan and I developed for camshaft grading or specking out camshafts. That is a factor of how aggressive the cam is. Give you an idea of the range we're looking at here. Pro stock, which is about the maximum you can go, is about 128 to 130. A nice quiet street grind for an RV that will last forever yet give you the best performance within those parameters is around about 91. On to the next set of figures. What we have here is the exhaust duration at 6, 50 and 200. Then the minor intensity and major intensity. Moving over just 2 columns more, we have the lobe area and the lobe lift in inches per degree. Now I haven't finished the calculations for this column yet, so ignore those numbers, but what it will tell you is approximately how much lift per degree your cam has, and it's just another indication of how aggressive it is. But the lobe area is the one that we need to take care of there. You can see that some of the numbers are really close, and that's the way it works out. You may be able to put in a cam with a little more aggression in it that makes just that extra bit of horsepower without sacrificing anything. Anyway, before we go on, I just realized that I am stacking you guys up with a whole load of numbers here. So I'm just going to scoot right across the page and give you a quick rundown on what else is there of relevance. You can see the column titles in black here, so they're self-explanatory. I have discussed what they were before, but what I want to bring your attention to is this white bar here, as this is where we determine what rocker ratio we actually need, not what we think we need. Remember I mentioned that on the first page. Put in the rocker ratio that you think you need. Now changing the rocker ratio means there's also a change in lobe centerline angle. Small but relevant. Remember, we're trying to get optimum here, not something close. So let's take a look at what we have here. The required valve lift in our case is 0.79. What we've actually got here is less than that, 0.63. Now that means we either need to look at another profile or we need to change our rocker ratios. Now if we change the rocker ratio, we go back to the first page and put in what this predicts we need into the intended rocker ratio, and it redoes all the calculations so that you've now got the right lobe center line again. You won't get that from the tech desk either. Again, moving over to the right, What we see here is the last of the outputs on this page. It's all pretty explanatory if you just read the titles. And at this point I want to cut things short without going into anything more here, because I've dwelt so long on what comes out of this program that I really need to get on and tell you how to use it. It couldn't be easier, I promise you. And this is a bit of good news. As far as the Chevrolet goes, we've only just touched on a small fraction of what it will do. Literally, I think we are about no more than 20% into what its capability is. So, on to the next section. Now, before going any further, I'd like to bring up a couple of points here. And this is based on speed of use. Let me address the professionals here, those guys who build engines, serious engines for a living. Let's say that you are the 1 in 1 billion who can get a cam right first time just by what you have up here. Make that 10 billion. Now, you've got the right cam and you've got to go through all the profiles out there to find the intake and the exhaust. Now, this means that you are going to look at something like, if you cover all the major brands, somewhere in the region of 6,000 cam combinations. How long do you think it's going to take you to go through those looking at the cam catalogue? Right, with just the profile list in there of all these cam manufacturers. And you're serious, you want one that is as close as possible. Well, I'll tell you, reasonably 30 minutes to an hour. That's 30 minutes to an hour where you, at probably $100 an hour, are just looking up to see what cam to use. Well, sure, you buy it and you might get $40 discount, so you've only made $40 that hour. Not good. Now, I'm going to show you how this program will do that selection in 90 seconds. Now, is that not a money saver right there? Think about it. Instead of spending almost an hour doing it, if you're lucky. Now we're going to check this 90 seconds to a total selection time out of the cams on our hydraulic rollers. Now remember, we've got 385 cam profiles here to choose from. So I'm going to run the clock only when I show you what to do, not when I'm explaining it. Here we go. This is how it's done. This data box. Now you will see that it has options on that. What you need to do is to click the top button, which will cancel out all the ones below it, and then click the one or ones you want and hit OK. Now by clicking that column, and this is how it looks when it's been clicked, we'll reduce the number of cams from 385 down to 282. So we've dropped the number of selections we have to solely the Pro Street Strip and race columns. Now how long did that take? Well, our ET is now standing at 5 seconds. Moving to the adjacent column, we have the data that we require to select either a single pattern or a dual pattern. That has already been done for us by what we entered in the first data page. This brings us to the end of part 1. The reason I'm splitting it into 2 parts, not to get extra clicks, it's just that all the details in the video was overloading my computer and my artwork program, and it was taking so long to save anything and hiccups started coming up, so I divided it in two. So if you're watching this within, say, 3 hours of it being posted, part 2 is on the way. I should have it up about 3 hours after this. Anyway, thank you for watching so far. Let's move on.